The 1780s were hard times for the farmers of Norway. Harvests were poor, trade was in recession. Officials and aristocrats from Denmark dominated positions of privilege and power. Growing popular discontent found a leader in the farmer Christian Loftus. Loftus first took his complaints to Crown Prince Frederick in Copenhagen in 1786. Later that year, he gathered a following of hundreds of farmers, and that alarmed authorities. They arrested Loftus, and the uprising was suppressed. The Loftus Rebellion reflected wider currents in Europe and beyond. American colonies had just fought a war of independence, proclaiming Enlightenment ideas of freedom and equality. In a few years, revolution would grip France, and it would transform the politics of Europe. Harvests were poor not just in Norway, but across the world. The Laki fissure eruption, which we described in Lesson 1, created unusual seasons which ruined crops. These crop failures were an important motivation for the Loftus Rebellion. However, farmers also rose up, not just because they were poor and hungry, but because they believed the royal government could and should help them during these difficult times. They weren't just passive victims of the Little Ice Age. They did not merely accept its hazards as a product of chance or God's punishment. Although the Loftus movement was suppressed, the authorities were forced to listen to the people. The royal government appointed a commission in 1787 to investigate peasant grievances. Corrupt officials were dismissed, and policy changes were made, including the abolition of Denmark's profitable monopoly on the grain trade in southern Norway. In this lesson, we'll examine responses to the Little Ice Age in the Nordic countries, how states and societies adapted, and how they built resilience to the shocks of a changing climate. From the 1990s and into the 2010s, historians of climate and society during the Little Ice Age, they usually focused on disasters and on crises. This focus was meant to show fellow historians that climate was an important force in history. It was also a warning that we needed to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions before it was too late. By the late 2010s, however, more historians began to study adaptation and resilience in the Little Ice Age. Global warming was already accelerating and already bringing more disasters. Historians sought stories of survival and of hope, and lessons from history for how to adapt to a changing climate. For example, Canadian historian Dagmar de Groot wrote about the success of the Dutch Republic during the late 1500s and 1600s, times when many other countries were suffering from the worst effects of the Little Ice Age. By contrast, this was the Netherlands' Golden Age, immortalized in paintings by Rembrandt and Vermeer. The Dutch succeeded by diversifying their agriculture and by developing new technologies. They also seized trade and colony from rival states and branched out into new areas of commerce and industry. In the early 1600s, for example, Dutch whalers became the first people to settle in Svalbard. We can also see some signs of material adaptation to the Little Ice Age in the Nordic countries during the late 1500s and 1600s. For example, the architecture of elite buildings improved to handle the cold and the damp. People chose safer building sites. They improved drainage. Sometimes they built more with brick. They dug stone cellars to keep food and drink from freezing. Over time, wealthy households switched to more efficient tile stoves for heating. But of course, average peasants still had to make do with wooden houses and open fireplaces. More significant transformations came during the last period of the Little Ice Age, in the 1700s and early 1800s. Nordic countries participated in discussions and discoveries of the Enlightenment. New universities and scientific societies were founded. Scholars, most famously Carl Linnaeus, gathered and experimented with novel plants and plant breeds in botanical gardens and in experimental farms. People also learned more about the weather and its variations. Thermometers and barometers were developed during the 1600s, and they became more widespread during the 1700s. Nordic scholars participated in international networks of weather observers. Anders Celsius from Uppsala invented the temperature scale, Celsius, that we still use around the world today. Hygiene was poor, and advances in medical treatment were modest. Smallpox vaccination helped bring down childhood mortality, starting in the early 1800s. However, effective treatment and prevention of most contagious diseases would have to await the discovery of germ theory in the 19th century, or antibiotics later in the 20th century. Nevertheless, the scientific study of medicine improved understanding of the influences between weather, farming, nutrition, and disease outbreaks. The life of Norwegian scholar Jakob Wilse illustrates these developments. Wilse was a prominent figure of the Nordic Enlightenment. He studied in Copenhagen and became a member of leading scientific societies. He observed the weather for the International Palatine Meteorological Society and made important contributions to the study of weather. He personally witnessed episodes of exceptional cold and mortality in Norway during the 1740s, 1770s, and 1780s. He saw the effects on crops and described how epidemics flourished due to malnutrition. Governments expanded their responses to disasters like these. In Scandinavia, laws of the 1600s and 1700s required parishes to set up local houses for the poor and other forms of poor relief. Fewer destitute people moving in search of food and shelter from one region to another also meant less spread of contagious diseases. Governments set up more granaries to store grain for bad years as well. Networks of roads and canals were improved, sometimes through work for welfare programs during the worst crisis years. Overall, Nordic economies became more commercial and diversified during this period. In other words, there were fewer subsistence farmers who depended on just what they could raise for themselves. However, the single most important adaptation to the Little Ice Age was probably the humble potato. Potatoes had been known in Europe since the 1500s when they came over from the Americas. However, they didn't become widespread in the Nordic countries until 2 centuries later. Potatoes could produce more calories on smaller plots of land than traditional grains, nor were they as exposed to the cold and the frost. In Norway, so-called potato priests encouraged the nation to adopt the new plant. The success of the potato helps explain declining death rates and growing populations in Scandinavia during the late 1700s. All of these adaptations had their limits, however. As the story of Christian Loftus shows, the Little Ice Age could still make life unbearably hard. Improvements also came more slowly to Iceland and to Finland. A Danish monopoly on trade saddled Iceland with more limited and expensive imports and slower development of domestic industries and exports. These restrictions were not lifted until after Iceland's so-called Famine of the Mist during the 1780s. Only after that did Iceland's population and economy grow consistently. Finland took decades to recover from the 1690s famine and the Great Wrath of the early 1700s. Although forestry exports accelerated during the 18th century, much of Finland remained poor and isolated, even by the standards of the time. The population started to grow more quickly in the late 1700s. Nevertheless, parts of the country suffered from shortages, epidemics, and even famine as late as the 1860s. For some people, the only way to adapt was to migrate. Throughout this period, some Swedish, Norwegian, and Finnish settlers moved north, encroaching on traditional Sami lands. Eventually, millions more from the Nordic countries made the longer trek across the Atlantic to North America, in a process of chain migration that would continue into the early 20th century. Those who escaped hard times spread news back home of exciting opportunities in America. For example, Carl Johann Freeman, who settled in Salem, Wisconsin in 1838, wrote to his family in Sweden of both hardships and wonderful opportunities on the American frontier. As he wrote, only people capable of hard work or possessed of wealth are equal to the life of a pioneer in America. But if the vigorous and efficient Swedes would ever rouse themselves and come here, they would find the best land for pioneers. Yet they ought to come soon, because the land is rapidly being settled, largely by Norwegians. Last summer, about 1,000 Norwegians came to this territory. Now, some adaptations like migration would go on to shape deeper transformations in Nordic society in the centuries that followed. In the 20th century, Nordic countries would establish some of the most stable democracies and some of the most successful welfare states in the world. Now in the 21st centuries, the Nordic countries seem better prepared than most others to face the challenges of global warming. Yet, major problems still lie ahead. So, what are those challenges? And could history help us answer them? That will be the subject of our next and final lesson.